Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's session of the IISD webinar series on investment law and policy. My name is Dietrich Brauch, and I'm an international law advisor at IISD. I'll be your moderator today. Can we go to the next slide, please? This webinar series is part of IISD's work with governments and civil society on legal and policy tools to leverage investment for sustainable development. Please visit our website to learn more about our work. Next, please. On our website, you will also find recordings as well as background documents of previous sessions of this webinar series, and you have the URL there. Next, please. And also on our website, specifically iisd.org/ITN, you can read investment treaty news for free. ITN is our online journal on investment law and policy, published in English, French, and Spanish. It includes short analysis pieces on investment law topics, also news reporting, case summaries of investment arbitration awards. You can access past issues of ITN going back to 2003, and you can subscribe to receive future issues, everything free of charge. Next, please. Our webinar today will focus on the Energy Charter Treaty, or the ECT, to modernize or to exit. The ECT is a treaty from 1994 that aimed to set out a multilateral framework for cooperation in the energy sector. It covers, among other areas, trade and investment, and provides for investor-state arbitration. A negotiation mandate to modernize the ECT was adopted late last year, with meetings planned throughout this year. So in this context, today's webinar will consider the history of the ECT, the so-called modernization process that's now underway, some aspects of reform, and possible termination of the treaty or withdrawal from the treaty. Our guest speaker today is Kyla Tienhaara. She is Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment and Assistant Professor in the School of Environmental Studies and Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. I, Martin Brauch, will be double-hatting today as speaker and also webinar moderator. Next slide, please. So here's our outline for today's webinar. I will first provide an introduction to the ECT, touching on its origins, statistics on ISDS, an initiative to expand the ECT to developing countries, and the ongoing modernization negotiations. I will then turn it over to Kyla, who will share with us why and how the ECT hinders climate action. Then I will pick it up from there and present some ideas for reforming the ECT in a sustainable and climate-friendly way. And finally, Kyla will look at the possible termination of the ECT or withdrawal from the treaty. Next, please. After our presentations, we will welcome your comments as well as your questions. You may submit them in writing at any point, even while Kyla or I are speaking. You can type them either into the webinar chat facility or into the Q&A facility on Zoom, if you're on your computer. We will have about 30 minutes for Q&A, and we'll aim at wrapping up the webinar in about an hour and 15 minutes from now, or an hour and 10 minutes from now. So next, please, and let's begin with our introduction to the Energy Charter Treaty. We can trace the history of this treaty to the European Energy Charter of 1991, which was a non-binding political declaration. At the end of the Soviet era, this declaration aimed at integrating the economies in transition in Eastern Europe and Central Asia into an energy cooperation framework with Western European states. As a next step, after the political declaration, these countries then concluded a binding agreement aimed at international cooperation in the energy sector, the Energy Charter Treaty. It was signed in December 1994 and entered into force in April 1998. As I'll detail next, it's a binding investment protection treaty geared towards energy investments. In 2015, there was another significant development. The International Energy Charter was signed. Again, this is a non-binding political declaration. It's an update of the European Energy Charter. Now, signing the International Energy Charter, which is a political declaration, is considered as a first step for a country towards acceding to the binding Energy Charter Treaty, so joining the binding framework. Next, please. As I mentioned, the ECT is considered a framework for international cooperation in the energy sector. It covers energy trade, transit, also efficiency. However, the investment-related provisions of the ECT are based on old generation models of bilateral investment treaties, BITs or BITs, which are nowadays heavily criticized. The primary focus of the ECT has been investment protection and investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS. The ECT contains provisions on old-style investor rights, which you would typically see in BITs or investment chapters in FTAs. These protections include the prohibition of direct and indirect expropriation, the fair and equitable treatment or FET standard, non-discrimination commitments, including national treatment, most favored nation treatment, MFN, and an umbrella clause. Investor-state arbitration under the ECT has been widely used by investors. As of December 18 last year, 128 arbitrations have been initiated under the ECT. And this makes the ECT the most frequently invoked instrument, the most frequently involved treaty in treaty-based investor-state arbitration. It accounts for about 13% of known ISDS cases. Also, the largest known ISDS award was rendered under the ECT in the Yukos v. Russia case. There were 3 awards that added up to 50 billion euro. This mechanism, the ISDS mechanism, can be and already has been used to dissuade countries from taking regulatory action against climate change. And in Kyla's first intervention in a few minutes, we will learn more about the risks posed by the ECT to climate action. Next, please. As of January this year, the Energy Charter Conference has 56 members. This comprises, the members comprise 54 states, plus the European Union and the European Atomic Energy Community. So most of the 54 states are Western European, Eastern European, and Central Asian. And this is in line with the original intention of the treaty, which was to promote energy cooperation between Western Europe and post-Soviet economies in transition. However, in 2012, the Energy Charter Conference launched the CONEXO policy. This stands for Consolidation, Expansion, and Outreach. And it aims at expanding the membership of the ECT by targeting countries that are outside those original global regions. Since then, since 2012, in a series of events and promotion activities, developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have been invited to sign the International Energy Charter, which, as I mentioned, is the first step, and ultimately invited to accede to the Energy Charter Treaty, becoming full members. Next, please. So partly as a result of the CONEXO expansion policy, there currently are 42 observers to the Energy Charter Conference. So the observers are countries or regional organizations, as you see in the list there, that have signed either the 91 Charter or the 2015 Charter, the political declarations, but they have not signed or ratified the 1994 binding ECT. ECT observers currently include several countries and regional organizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, developing countries. 4 countries are listed on the ECT's website as exceeding countries, and they're highlighted in the slide. So Burundi, Eswatini, which was formerly known as Swaziland, Mauritania, and Pakistan. These countries then are, or it suggests that these countries listed specifically as exceeding countries have taken or are taking further steps towards acceding to the ECT beyond signing either of the political declarations. Next slide, please. So in October 2017, discussions were launched on modernizing the ECT, and a subgroup on modernization was created. The original aim was to finalize discussions on modernization by end of last year, which hasn't happened, or at least the treaty hasn't been amended since, or by that deadline. The subgroup on modernization met 6 times throughout 2018, and it held consultations with observers and also with the energy industry. In November 2018, the Energy Charter Conference approved a list of topics for discussion on ECT modernization, again after consultations with observers and the energy industry. The list of topics is long. We're not going to look at it here, but it doesn't mean that it is comprehensive. So just to give you a few examples, the topics up for modernization include some investment protection issues, including FET, MFN, indirect expropriation. They also include issues related to dispute settlements, such as security for costs, valuation of damages, third-party funding. And the list also includes some more progressive topics, so to speak, such as the right to regulate, sustainable development, corporate social responsibility. However, the most contentious issue in the ECT, which is investor-state arbitration, is not explicitly mentioned as a topic for reform, for modernization. There's also no mention of climate change, no mention of the Paris Agreement and related issues, such as fossil fuel phase-out or the low-carbon transition. In October 2019, the Energy Charter Conference circulated a document laying out policy options for modernization. Now, this is a compilation of submissions from various ECT members on how the treaty should be modernized or not. So this document has 57 pages. It's available online, but we won't have a chance to look at it exhaustively here. The range of views there is varied. So some signatories, such as Japan, have suggested that the ECT does not need any changes. Others, such as the EU, have outlined a detailed set of changes and have suggested that modernization should also incorporate changes that are being discussed in other forums that debate investment law reform. For example, UNCITRAL Working Group 3 on ISDS reform. 5 signatories in these documents, namely Albania, Azerbaijan, the EU, Luxembourg, and Turkey, refer specifically to the need to align the ECT with climate change goals under the Paris Agreement. In November 2019, the Energy Charter Conference issued a mandate for negotiations on modernization, hoping to conclude them expeditiously according to a mandate. The first round of negotiations took place in December last year in Brussels. There's no public report on the meeting, but there are reports on the ECT website that say modernization would be a top priority for the ECT this year. And I quote from the website, quote, "Parties emphasize the unprecedented opportunity for the ECT modernization to promote innovative solutions by aligning the treaty with the Paris Agreement objectives," end quote. Other meetings for modernization are expected to happen in April, July, and October this year. And a stock-taking exercise would be conducted by the Energy Charter Conference in December this year. So now let's move to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Kyla.
Thanks very much for that, Martin, and thanks for the invitation to be here. And thank you to everyone who's online. I see a a lot of familiar names and a lot of people who are doing really great work on these topics. So great to have you all on here with us. So I'm going to start off just with a little bit about climate change. I assume that everyone listening in has a basic understanding. I'm not going to go through a whole big Al Gore type of explanation of the science, but I would like to take a brief moment to just emphasize the gravity of our current situation. So just a bit over a month ago, a comment was published in Nature by several eminent scientists arguing that there is a risk of certain tipping points, such as the loss of the Amazon rainforest or the West Antarctic ice sheet being reached, even between only 1 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Such tipping points could create abrupt and irreversible changes in the climate, which these scientists argue is an existential threat to human civilization. And if you aren't already aware, we are at 1 degree of warming already, and we're on track for much higher than 2. So at the time that this comment was written by these scientists, the world was really horrified and concerned about the fires in the Amazon. Since then, we've had the catastrophic start to the fire season in Australia, with 25 million hectares burned, 29 people have lost their lives, an estimated 1 billion animals have perished. And the fires have also released about 400 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is equal to 2/3 of the country's annual emissions from man-made sources. So I raise the example of Australia because I think it has, for many people, solidified the feeling that climate disruption is no longer something that is for us to worry about in the future. It is here and now. But I also raise it because the Australian government's response to the crisis is really, I think, emblematic of the disconnect that exists in many policy circles between the acceptance of climate science and the acceptance of the reality of what kind of economic and social change is really required to address it. And this connect really centers on the future of the fossil fuel industry. If we can go to the next slide. So the reality is that if we want to keep to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, we need to really rapidly phase out fossil fuels. And the industry has far more fossil fuels in known reserves than we can actually afford to burn. And yet, despite this, companies continue to explore for even more and continue to invest in the infrastructure required to extract, transport, and burn this so-called unburnable carbon. So as Andrew Grant from Carbon Tracker has noted, the oil majors are betting against a 1.5 degree world. In fact, I would suggest that they seem to be betting against even a 2 or 3 degree warmer world. All right, so next slide. And just in case anyone wants to jump in here to say that the industry is an important part of the transition, I think this is a useful pie chart that you may have seen going around Twitter recently. Simon Evans from Carbon Brief posted it. I think it pretty much speaks for itself. The industry is continuing to invest in fossil fuels and not really doing much at all into areas that would give us a livable future. All right, so next slide, if we can tie this back now to the Energy Charter Treaty. So as Martin has outlined, it contains ISDS provisions which allow companies to sue governments if those governments change the investment conditions, for example, through policies to address climate change. And as a result, governments can have to fork out big compensation payments. So what does that mean in the context of the changes that we need to see in the fossil fuel industry? So as has been very well documented, fossil fuel companies have known about the dangers of climate change through their own internal scientific research for decades. And rather than address it, they have done everything in their power to foster denial of the science. They have thrown millions, if not billions of dollars at this campaign of disinformation. And if in this context, if a government encourages investment in fossil fuel extraction or combustion, can we honestly say that the investor should have a legitimate expectation, and that's the type of thing that tribunals read into the fair and equitable treatment and other provisions? Can we say that they should have a legitimate expectation that those governments should not at some point come to their senses and change their policy to line up with scientific reality? Should we reward fossil fuel companies for successfully delaying action on climate change for so long by now paying them compensation when policy catches up? And should we reward them for knowingly investing in our collective destruction? I would think that most rational people would say no. In fact, they would say that the reverse is true and that we should actually be suing these companies for the damage that they have inflicted upon us. And I think that's why we now see so many groups and even cities are doing just that in the domestic courts in the US and elsewhere. Next slide. Apart from being just morally reprehensible to spend public funds that should be invested in a Green New Deal on compensating these companies, there are also some other issues that I think we should consider. The first one that I've been thinking about is the fact that if ISDS is meant to reduce certain forms of risk and thereby increase flows of investment, that's the theory, then we need to think about the type of risks that are relevant in the context of fossil fuels and climate change. So if ISDS reduces stranded asset risk, so that's the financial risk associated with the fact that these substantial fossil fuel reserves are unburnable and must be left in the ground, and that other assets like pipelines and power plants are unlikely to be able to be used for their full potential lifespan if we want to actually keep within our climate targets. So if it reduces this stranded asset risk by shifting that risk to the public, then one could argue that this incentivizes further investment in the sector and that further inflates the so-called carbon bubble. And people are concerned that, you know, one of the things that could happen if this carbon bubble bursts is that we could have a large financial recession or crisis as a result. So that's one possible negative outcome. Next slide. Another is that, a worse outcome is that ISDS is used to stall action on climate change, something Martin's already alluded to. So I've spent a lot of time studying regulatory chill. I have no doubt that it occurs. And as is clear from this quote from the Chevron VP, it's clear that this so-called deterrent effect in their language is something that they find attractive about ISDS. But I think that one thing I have historically failed to do is connect the discussion about regulatory chill to a broader understanding of corporate power. And I think this is particularly relevant when we look at the fossil fuel industry and how it has responded to the issue of climate change. So as I've already noted, for the past 30 plus years, the fossil fuel industry has been well aware of its role in disrupting the planet's climate system. But rather than act to avert catastrophe, it has been building what Professor William Carroll at the University of Victoria and others who are involved in the corporate mapping project here in Canada call the regime of obstruction. And this regime has been really highly successful in blocking any serious action on climate change. So meaningful action on climate change requires us to dismantle this regime of obstruction. And I'm certainly not suggesting that ISDS is the most significant part of the regime. There are many components. There's the media, there's the revolving door between industry and government, there's anti-climate think tanks, and all these sort of components. But I do believe that ISDS could play an increasingly significant role in the future, especially as fossil fuel companies really begin to lose their social license and start to move into what's called like the last gasp of the dying industry phase, in which they're going to try to wring out every last bit of profit before the jig is up. Next slide. So I think we're already starting to see this in coal, which is in structural decline. So we had a NAFTA case launched here in Canada in 2018. And now there's the threat of one or more energy charter treaty cases in the Netherlands. So I don't have time to go into these cases in detail, and there are really some excellent resources out there if you're interested in more information about this. And in particular, I'd highlight that Client Earth has done an excellent briefing on the Uniper threat to the Dutch coal phase out. And also starting next week, there's going to be a series of webinars put on by Urgewald and the Climate Action Network with speakers from SOMO and TNI and others. So there's some great work being done on that. Next slide. So before I turn it back over to Martin, I just want to say one more thing about a sort of common refrain that is made in defense of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is that it isn't a treaty to support the fossil fuel industry. Instead, it's a quote unquote technology neutral treaty. And first of all, in reference to that, Dr. Yamina Saheb, and I'm apologizing, I think she's on the line if I've pronounced that incorrectly. She's done a really great report on the Energy Charter Treaty generally, and there's some really great statistics about greenhouse gas emissions covered and so forth. But she points out the fact that this is really a myth, this technology neutral idea, because the ECT really only protects the supply side of energy, and things like efforts to reduce energy demand are not covered. And apart from that, I would also note, I would highlight this industry advisory panel that gives advice to the ECT. Of course, there's no civil society advisory panel. We only have an industry one. If you look at the composition of that, I think it's pretty clear that it's dominated by fossil fuel interests. We've got, some carbon majors like BP and Shell. We also, of course, have Uniper, who are actively involved in threatening using the ECT against the Dutch. But even if we accept this idea that it's technology neutral and we ignore that other evidence, what does that mean? What does it mean to be technology neutral in 2020? Does it mean that you are neutral about Australia being on fire? Does it mean that you are neutral about the future of human civilization? To me, that is just completely unacceptable. So with that happy note, I'm going to hand it back over to Martin.
Thank you, Kyla. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is actually the perfect segue for my for the next part of my presentation, which will focus on reform. So after Kyla's presentation on the need for urgent climate action, and also about the risks that the ECT poses to climate action, the need for reforming the ECT should be evident. And the question that arises is, how can the ongoing modernization process be leveraged for meaningful reform? In other words, how to align the ECT with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as well as with climate change objectives under the Paris Agreement and other relevant treaties. So now I will share a few ideas based mostly on the Treaty on Sustainable Investment for Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. This is a model treaty developed by a team of international lawyers, economists, energy policy advisors, and communications experts. We called our team the Creative Disruptors, and I served as the leader of this team and lead author of the treaty. The treaty was one of the co-winners of the Stockholm Treaty Lab Prize. This model treaty has 3 pillars, as you can see on the screen: discouraging and eliminating unsustainable investments, including carbon-intensive investments, energy investments. The other pillar is promoting and increasing sustainable investments, including low-carbon energy investments. And the third pillar, ensuring a just transition to more sustainable and low carbon economies and societies. I will now point to some of the ideas of our model and how can they be applied in a way to reform the ECT in light of climate and sustainability goals. Next, please. So in order to discourage and eliminate climate-unfriendly investment, ECT members would first need to amend the treaty to allow discrimination between climate-friendly and climate-unfriendly energy investments. Because as the treaty stands, it protects both carbon-intensive and low-carbon investments as if they were equally desirable. To recall the term that Kyla has just used, we would need to move away from this formal technology neutrality currently embedded in the ECT. So one way to do so is by changing the definition of investment in the treaty. So for example, you could have a positive list approach in which only low carbon energy investments that are listed in a schedule submitted by the party would be considered as covered by the ECT for that party. Or in a negative list approach, all energy investments would be considered covered by the ECT, except for those that are listed in a schedule of carbon-intensive energy that are then excluded. Another way to allow discrimination is to define the scope of investment protection. That is, to define which investments would benefit from the protection of the treaty. And this could also be done under positive or negative list approach, as I've just explained. And the third way to allow discrimination would be to change the scope of ISDS. So for example, in a positive list approach, you would list low carbon energy investments, and those would have access to ISDS, so only those. And alternatively, in a negative list approach, all energy investments would have access to ISDS, except for those that were excluded through a list of carbon-intensive energy investments, which this negative approach is known as the ISDS carve-out, which is something that ECT members could consider. Next slide, please. Now that we've discriminated between the two types of investments, the good and the bad, the green and the brown, we can think of how to discourage unsustainable, climate unfriendly investments. And here, one way could be to set a timeline to phase out the establishment of new carbon-intensive projects. So for example, ECT members could agree that after 5 years, they would no longer allow the establishment of certain carbon-intensive projects. 5 years here, of course, being just an example. Similarly, they could agree to a timeline to phase out subsidies for carbon-intensive investments, such as fossil fuel subsidies. Our model also would remove treaty protection from carbon-intensive investments. In our model, unsustainable carbon-intensive investors would still have recourse to domestic court actions, but they would not have access to treaty-based investment arbitration, which is something that could also be considered for the ECT. Next, please. Also, an ECT that is not technology neutral could specifically promote low carbon energy investments. It could provide treaty rights that are similar to those provided in traditional investment treaties, but following our model, we would suggest that these provisions would be more narrowly circumscribed to take into account ongoing efforts to reform international investment law. So, for example, a revised ECT could still have a non-discrimination provision limited to post-establishment national treatment, NFN. It would ideally not include a controversial fair and equitable treatment clause, but you can consider a standard of treatment provision based, for example, on the Indian model or on recent EU treaties that have an exhaustive list of breaches of this standard of treatment. It could also provide for direct expropriation only, avoiding and expressly excluding indirect expropriation, as done in treaties concluded by Brazil. All these ideas would provide greater certainty in the application of the treaty and help bring it in line with investment law reform efforts. Also building on our model and others, the ECT could promote responsible investment by balancing these investor rights also with investor obligations. These could include an obligation to comply with international law and domestic law, anti-corruption obligations, a provision on corporate social responsibility or CSR. Now, the revised ECT could also include explicit provisions on state rights to protect the state's right to regulate, to pursue development goals. These provisions have been included in the model BIT of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, the Pan-African Investment Code with the PAIC or PIKE, among other model treaties. And finally, the revised ECT could include state obligations with respect to some of the sustainable development aspects of the energy sector. For example, there could be an obligation for the state to keep high standards in terms of environmental protection or labor and human rights. And states could also commit to requiring impact assessments before the establishment of energy investments. And this could cover environmental, social, human rights, as well as climate change impacts. Next, please. The third pillar in our model is to provide a just transition to environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable economies and societies. It's important that the ECT acknowledge this need, as this encompasses the need for economic restructuring that results from the low carbon transition. For example, the displacement of workers in changing industries, job losses, adaptation to the physical effects of climate change that will lead to involuntary migration, etc. The ECT may not, of course, be the best place to provide exhaustively on a just transition, because a just transition won't only depend on the regulation of energy investments. So the solution we proposed in our model is to endorse existing instruments. So first to acknowledge the need for the just transition, and then refer and incorporate by reference instruments that have been negotiated in other fora. So this ensures that these instruments are taken into account and can serve as guidance in the interpretation of the treaty, and in this case, the ECT. Next, please. Now, an important point that cuts across the three pillars: the revised ECT, in our view, should go beyond ISDS. In our model, we suggest an accountability mechanism that could be also incorporated in the ECT. Through mediation and compliance processes, individuals and communities could raise their concerns about energy investment projects. They could bring complaints and then help hold investors and states accountable for their obligations under the treaty. A revised ECT should also consider dispute prevention, such as mediation. There are also the mechanisms proposed in Brazilian investment treaties, which can be considered. With respect to dispute settlement, the ECT should consider our alternatives to arbitration, such as adjudication, either international adjudication or domestic adjudication. You could also consider incorporating reform efforts proposed at UNCITRAL or discussed at UNCTAD, or included in national or regional model treaties that are now being published around the world. And finally, the ECT should consider going beyond the investor versus state paradigm. In our model, we provide for broad standing, broad access to justice, allowing also states to initiate claims or individuals and communities. This would be a way to promote sustainable energy investments that act responsibly with respect to the communities they affect, because they can, after all, be sued if they do not act responsibly. And now, to conclude our presentations, back to Kyla. If climate-friendly modernization doesn't succeed, what about terminating the ECT or withdrawing from it?
Thanks a lot, Martin. So I really want to applaud Martin for the excellent work he's done and all the thought that he's put into examining what a climate-friendly investment treaty could look like. And I hope that no one takes anything I'm about to say as diminishing the importance of that work. I think it's really fantastic. But for me, at this particular juncture, I do believe that the best avenue is for states to exit the Energy Charter Treaty as quickly as possible. So one of the reasons for that is that reform negotiations would take time, and we simply don't have any. So the 2018 IPCC special report has been widely cited as giving us 12 years to act in order to save ourselves. Sadly, many suggest that we actually have much less time than that. So we need to be taking climate action now, and we can't afford to go through those long kind of negotiations to get a treaty that's not going to protect fossil fuels and therefore hinder climate action. In addition to that time factor, I don't feel like there's any indication at this point that there's sufficient appetite for the kind of reform that Martin is suggesting, or even much less ambitious reforms. So he's already noted that Japan doesn't think that the ECT needs to change at all. And others have also pointed out that, of course, there's going to be fervent opposition from states that have any significant fossil fuel industries to any kind of reform that would remove protection for those industries. In terms of whether we should be worried about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I'm often told I should be in favor of ISDS because it can protect the renewable energy industry, and there have been so many renewable energy cases under the ECT. I've written about that in the past. I haven't seen any solid evidence that suggests that ISDS actually helps countries to attract investments in renewable energy, which is the only sort of justification you could have for it. And even if such evidence did all of a sudden come up, I think that there are better ways that we could go about that. A lot of, there's a lot of studies that have showed that feed-in tariffs are really successful in attracting investment, and a lot of the issues have to do with getting access to finance, and there's been discussions in the G20 and other forums about coming up with special regimes to provide finance. And in any case, we see that the cost of renewable energy is plummeting, and so that the requirements for more sort of help for those industries are actually falling as well. Other things that we could obviously do is to even the playing field by getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies and so forth. So I think there's a lot that we can do for renewable energy investment outside of the sort of discussions about ISDS. So I don't think that dumping ISDS completely is going to mean an end to the to the renewable energy sector. So I'm not really concerned about that. And in terms of how I, generally see these things, I again just want to emphasize something that some historical scholars who have been looking at historical transitions, Turnheim and Gales, have noted in an article back in 2012, is that quote, the weakening the cultural, political, economic, and technological dimensions of fossil fuel related industries is just as important as stimulating green options. So I again see withdrawal and exit from the ECT as part of this effort that we need to sort of destabilize that industry, destabilize the regime of obstruction. What about the mechanics of that? Well, there is obviously a serious obstacle to exiting the regime, which is the survival clause. I believe it's 20 years, which means that any unilateral withdrawal by a state will not take effect for another 20 years. So you can see that in the example of Italy withdrew from the ECT, and it's still having to deal with cases because of this clause. That's obviously totally unacceptable in terms of a time frame. We don't want 20 more years of fossil fuel industry cases coming up. So that means we need a negotiated exit rather than unilateral withdrawals, which again could run into the same problems as reform in terms of opposition from countries that aren't interested in termination. So there's still that problem there. I don't know how to get around that, but I would say that if we could achieve this in the Energy Charter Treaty, then it would also set a really excellent example for how to possibly achieve a multilateral exit agreement that we need, I believe, to deal with the other 3,000 or more problematic agreements that have ISDS, the bilateral treaties and the trade agreements that contain ISDS. So I think we've got an opportunity here because this modernization discussion is ongoing, and countries such as Luxembourg have even noted that they are open to the idea of termination. So I think that's definitely something that we should be really looking at pushing for. And that's it for me.
Thank you once again, Kyla. Can we go to the next slide, please? So now I'm very happy to launch the Q&A part of our webinar. For those of you who have not asked a question and would like to do so, please type your question into the webinar chat facility or the Q&A facility on Zoom. And I am very happy with our group here because not only there are several questions, but most of them are already answered. This, of course, is not recorded in the video, so I will actually read out some of the very interesting questions and also the responses that have been posted in the chat. So one question from Jörg Haas was, what happened with the 50 billion award UCOS versus Russia? I think it was never paid without consequences. And Oliver Hales replied, I think the UCOS matter is still pending before the Court of Appeal of The Hague, which rendered the first interim judgment in September 2018, dismissing most of the claimant's motion that some of Russia's arguments in the annulment proceedings should have been disregarded under Dutch procedural law. Nothing paid yet, although parallel proceedings in the European Court of Human Rights awarded 2 billion euro. I thank you both to Jörg and also to Oliver for the question and also an answer that sounds correct to me. I would not have been able to give a more up-to-date reply, but yes, to my knowledge, it still hasn't been paid, and As Olivier pointed out, the parallel European Court of Human Rights proceedings did result in a 2 billion award for the claimants. Another questions relate to posting links to the reports cited, Yamina Saheb's report. Again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Yamina, if you're still online with us. And also the Carol and others report, which is forthcoming. We have the links and we'll be happy to share those with you also by email later on. Let me look at the other questions here. Right, again, Jurghas asked, could the EU sustainable finance taxonomy be used for the definition of sustainable investments? This is, in fact, something that we have been looking into at IISD. There's a colleague of ours, Max Linzen, here at IISD, who has worked quite a lot with the EU finance taxonomy. And in treaties that would have a definition of investment of the sort of definition that I've presented to you, certainly the EU taxonomy could be a useful tool for countries to decide what would be included in this. Not so much about what could be excluded, I understand. It's my understanding of the finance taxonomy, but it could still be a very useful tool for countries in this respect. Now, again from your house, the question for EU member states, are these member states only individually members of the ECT, or is the EU as a whole also a member? So both, quick answer is yes, both. So would individual EU member states just withdraw individually and still be covered by EU membership in the ECT? Mark Meis response here, EU members and EU. So yes, members and EU must withdraw. I would concur with that. I think it's also a matter of EU law, because I know, and this is not my area of expertise, but I know that EU law has a way to apportion responsibility when the EU is sued under, or appears as a respondent under investor state arbitrations. And for a member that has individually withdrawn, but is still, of course, a member from the ECT, but is still, of course, a member of the EU, and the EU is then a respondent, and then responsibility is apportioned to that member, I'm not exactly sure how that would work out. So for certainty, it would, of course, be preferable if the member withdraws, as well as the European Union as a regional organization withdraws. I don't know, Kyla, if you'd like to comment on the EU law element.
I'm not an EU law expert. I wouldn't want to comment on that. Do you want me to go with deal with the other ones that are more specifically to me, or?
Absolutely. So I see some others here, and in fact, very prudent of you not to comment on EU law, which I just tried to do, and not very wise of me. But other reasons. So, question from Shira: other reasons why ISDS for renewable energy companies aren't helpful. Even if a decision is favorable to the company, it doesn't lead to legislative changes, which are needed for systemic change. And it excludes domestic small investors, such as is the case in Spain, where families lost all they invested under the PP government, who can't use ISDS from the families, of course. So why have a mechanism that only helps the big corporations and not the small guys? Kyla, would you like to comment on that beyond what you already said? Excellent points.
Yes. So I completely agree with you, and I think there's other things that we could say about this in terms of the fact that a lot of the people that are suing Spain and so forth are not actually renewable investment companies. They're just companies that are involved in finance. And so the money going back to them doesn't really necessarily mean it's going to go back into renewable energy. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why it doesn't really help at all with climate change, having renewable energy ISDS cases. And you know, especially in this context when we're talking about countries like Spain, which have perfectly decent courts, and there's no reason why. I mean, I would debate whether ISDS can be justified even if you have terrible domestic courts, but in this case, there's no doubt that the domestic courts should be sufficient. And I've written a lot about that particular topic, but it is in a journal that is very difficult to get access to. So if anybody wants a copy, feel free to just send me an email at kt71@queensu.ca or kyla.tienhaara@queensu.ca, and I'm happy to send you a copy. The next question is also relevant for me. So it's, please explain regulatory chill and why ISDS is a deterrent. Again, I've got articles on this that I can share, but just to go through it briefly, the idea of regulatory chill is that merely the existence of ISDS or the specific threat of a case can be enough for a government to decide not to do what it was planning on doing. So it might decide not to regulate at all, or it might decide to change its regulation in a way that is more friendly to the investor, but less actually effective in terms of the environmental issue or the health issue and so forth. And regulatory chill has been documented in a lot of different cases. There's actually, if you want to watch a funny discussion of regulatory chill, then I suggest that you Google John Oliver's discussion of tobacco from a couple years ago. It's on YouTube. He actually had sort of investigative journalist type work going on where he found letters that had been written by tobacco companies to small African and other countries saying, look, here is this cases that are going on in Australia and Uruguay, and we're suing those governments for doing similar things to what you want to do around tobacco regulation. So, you know, you're going to be on the hook for millions, billions of dollars if you go ahead with this. So that's the kind of thing. I've talked about it in terms of 3 different kind of types. There's this internal chill that means that governments just don't come up with strong regulations in the first place because they're worried about the trade implications. And Gus Van Harten and some of his colleagues looked at some cases of that in terms of the way governments in Canada and in Ontario specifically think about these things when they're actually developing regulation. Then there's threat chill, which is specifically a case where an investor says, we are going to sue you if you do this. And then what I've called transnational chill, which is sort of more this idea that other countries will look to what's happening. So for example, New Zealand looked at what was happening in Australia on tobacco regulation and the ISDS case there and said, we're going to hold off and see what happens with that case before we adopt the similar kind of plain packaging rules. Of course, thankfully, Australia won that case, but it went on for years. So you could argue, some people have argued that delay in regulation in New Zealand might have cost people's lives. Obviously, with an issue like climate change, where we want countries all over the world to adopt regulations at the same time, this kind of transnational chill, I think, is an issue. The second part of Neil McCauley's question was, what would you replace the Energy Charter Treaty with? And I think the answer is I would not replace it. I don't think that there's any, at least not the investor-state dispute settlement part. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about the other aspects of the Energy Charter Treaty and the transit and things like that. I don't know anything about those. I'm an ISDS expert here. So I would not replace it at all. I don't think that it actually functions to do anything useful. So the original claims was that ISDS would help particularly countries in the global south to attract investment, but there's no proof that that actually occurs. So I think it was, there's no need to replace it with anything. There are, of course, other things that we can do, as I said, in other areas to try to promote renewable energy investments and other types of green, quote unquote, investments. So the next one from York House says, I wonder what I should recommend to the German Greens who are likely to enter the next German government and therefore in a relatively powerful position. If we say that Germany should simply withdraw, Germany is still covered for the next 20 years and it would lose its influence over negotiations over termination or reform. I think that there's a response to that. Yes, so Pia Eberhardt says, yes, you can still be sued for 20 years when you leave, but only for investments that already exist at this point. All future investments will be shielded by a treaty exit. So that's a good point. So Jörg, please recommend that German Greens to exit because, as Kyla said, what is there worth saving? So I think that's a great response.
Can I also
comment
on,
please jump in.
or maybe try to react to Jörg's question here? I think one important potential contribution by Germany here, if you would like to send recommendations to the German Greens, is you can also, if you're revising a treaty, you can also revise the survival clause, and assuming you're correct that Germany will have this influence, then why not also include this within your recommendations? Try to make it work, make a safer withdrawal for you, but also for other countries that may be willing to withdraw, that the survival clause wouldn't apply to them or would be reduced, perhaps, even though Pierre is correct that it would only apply to those investments that already exist. But even so, you could take the opportunity of revision to change your survival clause. That's perfectly possible under international law.
That's a great point.
Should we go to, there was a follow-up to Jörg Haas's question, and maybe I can just read that quickly. To complement my previous question regarding Germany's potential role, in some way I wonder if just leaving, like Italy, to clarify, Italy left the ECT framework a couple of years ago, would actually squander Germany's potential as a really big and powerful member of the EU and the ECT. What could a really ambitious political strategy for Germany look like? What leverage could Germany exert to press for termination or ambitious reform? Kyla, would you like to comment on that?
I think I think what you just said in terms of that approach to doing some negotiations, but including revision of the withdrawal, the survival clause is quite a smart strategy. In terms of like ambitious other elements to include in the modernization, I think Martin has really outlined a lot of really ambitious elements. How much of that, I don't know how much power Germany has. But yeah, I think that that way, if you think it makes sense for them to stay in to exert pressure, and that definitely makes sense to me, then I think that element that he's just mentioned about making sure that survival clause is revised so that there is the option to exit for any country that does want to. I think that's a great strategy.
Great. So, and there's also a question here from Mathilde Dupré. French trade minister told us last week that he's not afraid about threat as the Uniper one in the Netherlands, which has also investment in coal plants in France, she clarifies. As the trade minister considers that this is no longer possible for EU investors to file ISDS cases against EU member states under the ECT. How and when this might be clarified? This is, again, a bit of an EU law related question, but from the point of view of investor state arbitration, and I think Kyla, you can complement later, but my first response is investor state tribunals have not really applied ACMEA as the European Court of Justice would have liked them to. They are still affirming jurisdiction on cases, over cases between an investor from an EU member state against another EU member state, even though this decision by the European Court of Justice in the ACMEA case suggests that this would no longer be possible. And this is what gives the French trade minister confidence to say, we're not worried, this is not going to happen. Well, investor to state arbitration tribunals do not seem inclined to verify the French trade minister's suspicion that this is no longer a threat. Kyla, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I worry about regulatory chill, is because there's so little clarity in how cases are going to go, that you know, the people that argue that governments can be confident that cases won't arise are, you know, assuming that there's consistency in the arbitration world, which there isn't, and then assuming that governments have and you know, have perfect information, and therefore are not can make totally rational decisions. And just with reference to other cases that have emerged with France, because I mentioned the Uniper threat, but I didn't go into the other cases. So Rockhopper versus Italy is about offshore oil, and there was a case that was highlighted about France. Vermilion was an oil company that made a threat to use ECT and to use ISDS under the ECT, and then, you know, the regulation. And this has been written up, I believe, by TNI, Transnational Institute, as well as maybe others. So it's regulatory chill. It's difficult to say how much the ISDS aspect played into the government's decision to change its approach. But certainly, I think that in the past, at least, it seems like the French have perhaps been a little bit more worried about the ECT, and maybe they have specific legal advice about the application of ACMEA, but I wouldn't think that that's a good solid kind of we don't have to worry about it kind of thing. So again, not an expert on EU law, but I wouldn't take that as being an appropriate response from the French trade minister.
Thank you for that, Kyla. I would just like to acknowledge that there are some questions in the Q&A window as well, that rest assured we're not missing you. We'll get to you. Let me go to the next question here, if I can find it here. Would the fact, from Olivier Hales, would the fact that the ECT mentions the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and its preamble, also incorporate the targets in the Paris Agreement and thereby help states in defending ambitious decarbonization measures? Yeah, I can quickly react to this, and then maybe Kyla can also comment. I would say that the mention in the preamble is, of course, useful. I wouldn't say that the reference to the convention also incorporates the targets in the Paris Agreement, because they are separate agreements. You can be a party to the UNFCCC, as most countries are, but not necessarily a party to the Paris Agreement. So, you know, it's a separate agreement. You would have to subscribe to that one separately for the targets to be applicable to you. So in any event, it is a useful reference in terms of state defense in any investor-state arbitration proceedings about decarbonization measures, but it's of course not a safe defense or an entirely foolproof defense in case an investor-state tribunal is willing to look at the investment protection aspects of the ECT that say, look, there are these, you know, an investment arbitrator may well say, there are, of course, these new targets, but also the ECT is technology neutral and provides some protection to fossil fuel investments, and the existence of new targets under the climate change regime does not remove those protections. So that would be my first answer. It's useful, but it's not entirely, you know, it's not an entirely foolproof strategy in the sense of guaranteeing a state defense in those measures. Kyla?
Yeah, I would just add that because the Paris Agreement doesn't dictate how states are meant to decarbonize, I think it's fairly easy for a tribunal to say, like, we're not saying that you can't decarbonize, we're just saying that you shouldn't have done it in this particular manner. Like, you're supposed to, like trade agreements say you're supposed to do things in the least trade restrictive manner. I think investment agreements effectively say you're supposed to do things in the least investment restrictive manner. So they, especially if you're talking about, you know, supply side policies, they, so for example, in the Canadian case, the issue was that Alberta phased out coal power, and gave transition payments to all the power companies that were going to be moving to natural gas and to renewable energy. But there was an American mining company that fed coal directly into those plants and didn't have any option to export it elsewhere because there was no infrastructure. And so it effectively meant a phasing out of that mining, of extraction, even though that wasn't the actual policy. And they felt that they should get a compensation payment, a transition payment, even though they're not transitioning to anything. And they're arguing that that's against the national treatment standard because the power companies were Canadian and the extraction company was American. So a tribunal in that case is just going to look very narrowly at this issue of transition payments. They're not going to be saying, you know, the Paris Agreement to them, I think, would be irrelevant. So I don't think that the preamble is going to really help.
Thank you, Kyla. Let me look at the next comment here. So Mark Mays says, first step, I think in response to the discussions of ISDS between investors from an EU member state against another EU member state. He says, the first step should be that all EU member states sign an agreement to terminate ISDS between them. I would just comment that this agreement is in fact in discussion among EU member states. And for perfect clarity and certainty here, this agreement would of course have to mention that the ECT is one of the instruments under which an investor from one member state can no longer sue a respondent state from another or another respondent state in the EU. Let me see, one of the questions in the Q&A would be, would the silence about indirect expropriation would the silence about indirect expropriation be a solution to eliminate the controversy about this issue, considering the existence of national treatment in some treaties that can support a potential compensation or indemnification? Would you want to comment on this, Kyla?
I'm not sure what's meant by the silence about indirect expropriation.
It doesn't, if it only covers direct, not indirect.
Oh, right. Yeah, so the example I just raised about the NAFTA case, it is a question in that case of national treatment being the issue. So I mean, indirect expropriation historically has been the big issue that people are concerned about with the right to regulate, but then it sort of shifted to fair and equitable treatment as it became clear that it was a little bit more difficult to make a case around indirect expropriation. So I think one problem I see with modernization and reform is that whenever you sort of tie up the loopholes in one area, they sort of lawyers find ways to make new ones in other areas. So I don't think that just excluding indirect expropriation is a solution. I would also just throw out there, this is a rather outside the general area of this conversation and more related to my other work, but there have been people that have suggested that one way to deal with the problems of the power of the fossil fuel industry is to actually directly expropriate fossil fuel companies and just take away that that obstruction. Obviously, not something that I think many countries are talking about seriously. But if you looked at Jeremy Corbyn's Labour manifesto, which obviously won't be implemented because he wasn't elected, but there was a lot of talk about nationalizing the energy grid and trains and so forth. So nationalization for decarbonization is, I think, kind of an interesting concept, and we're not there right now, but I definitely wouldn't want to reform a treaty to get rid of indirect expropriation and cut off that option of directly expropriating fossil fuels if there was a leader that thought that was a good approach to decarbonization. I don't know if that really answers the question, but thought I'd throw that out there.
I can try to address it as well. Whether the silence about indirect expropriation would be a perfect solution to eliminate any controversy about this issue is, of course, as Kyla just pointed out, uncertain. You can't really, especially in the presence of other standards of treatment like fair and equitable treatment that might be invoked. The reference here to the national treatment clause, I think, so I don't know of many legislations, and certainly not in the background that I come from. I don't know of domestic legislation that provides for protection for indirect expropriation. Yes, national legal systems do provide protection against expropriation, direct expropriation. But I guess the risk here would be more, perhaps be more or lie more likely with the most favored nation clause. So for example, if an investor were to invoke the most favored nation clause to say, look, you're not promising indirect protection against indirect expropriation under the ECT, but to other nations, you're promising protection against indirect expropriation under other treaties. So I want to import this provision into the ECT back, even if it's explicitly excluded like that. An investor could attempt to argue that, and an investor state arbitration tribunal could be sympathetic to that argument, which has happened. It wouldn't be unheard of. And it's again, going back to what Kyla said, these reform initiatives, you can try to tweak things there, here and there, and improve the language of the clauses, but you would have to be very careful to do an overhaul, not just fixing specific provisions to address specific issues that, you know, investors may be able to find a backdoor through which they can bring the same issue back again. So that's my view. It would have to be a very dramatic overhaul of the whole framework. I'm looking here at some other questions. Let me see. There's, so Oliver Hales has just shared, as to the legal and political means to neutralize the sunset clause, this article is useful. And he's sharing a link that we will send to you later on. I think, Kyla, there's one interesting question for you here, and I suppose we have to close with this question because we're about to run out of time. Thomas Dauphin asks, could you please expand on why the argument that the ECT is technology neutral is untrue? And I understand that formally it's true, but I think he wants you to, he would like you to expand on why in practice this is not the case.
Sure. So I'm just actually going to quote from that report that's been shared by Yamina Saheb. So, contrary to the myth, the ECT is neither fuel nor technology neutral, as it does not cover all economic activities in the energy sector. Investments protected by the ECT relate to economic activities of a detailed list of energy materials and products, which includes nuclear energy, coal, natural gas, petroleum, and petroleum products, electrical energy, and other energy sources such as fuel, wood, and wood charcoal. Renewable energy sources used for electricity production are also protected, while distributed heat to multiple premises is explicitly excluded from EC protection. ECT provisions protect economic activities on the supply side only. These activities include those related to the exploration, extraction, refining, production, storage, land transport, transmission, distribution, trade, marketing, or sale of energy and materials and products. Economic activities and investments in measures to reduce energy demand and energy services essential for the delivery of a decarbonized energy systems are neither protected by the ECT, nor are energy savings included in the ECT list of energy materials and products. So I would, if you want to read more about that, I would refer you to that report, but I think that she's really clearly made that case.
Thank you so much, Kyla. I will just read one final comment here before I wrap up. So from Cornelia Marfield, and she's replying to Jörg Haas's questions on what to recommend to Germany. And her response is, Germany should not press for reform because reform will fail inevitably. See Kyla's arguments, i.e. it would be a waste of time Germany should exit and lead a coalition of countries that agree not to allow ISDS claims from investors within the coalition against other coalition members. This coalition should adopt a joint instrument on withdrawal of consent to ISDS under the ECT, and also other legal and political means to neutralize the sunset clause, or the survival clause that we were discussing, must urgently be explored. So I just thought it would be interesting to bring this final comment. And then if we can go to the next slide, please, Sophia. I apologize to some of you that asked a few questions that we will not be able to tackle today, but since we're running out of time, I would like to say thank you very much to you, Kyla, especially our expert speaker today, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And also, I would like to thank you, participants, for joining and participating very actively with lots of comments and questions, and we really appreciate that. This video will be available on our YouTube channel as well as our website, and you have the link posted. We will also let you know by email, for those of you who registered, as soon as the webinar is available for viewing. So in closing, I'd like to thank also my ISD colleagues, Sofia Balinho, who's doing the technical moderation behind the scenes, and also to Elise Epp, who did the design work for our Twitter card. Thank you very much once again for attending this session of ISD's webinars, and hope to see you in our next webinars.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you everybody for joining in.
Thanks. Bye. Have a good day.